So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Wilson, with whom the library has been collaborating for a number of months to bring this series to you, and who's really the mover and shaker and catalyst for this series. And she will introduce our presenter tonight. So.
Thank you, Kristen and Lynn. I'm so grateful that the library is behind this kind of program where we learn so much about a native son. Just a few words. He's always hurting people's feelings. Not one person in 1,000 likes him, and a great many people detest him because he is so darn full of himself. These are comments of his friends. Imagine, William Carlos Williams knew him in college, in their college years, and that was the one, he's so darn full of himself. That didn't change. And He's Always Hurting People's Feelings was by W.B. Yeats. Just so you know, everybody has a hard time with this very difficult and complicated man. I am delighted to introduce Ted Dyer, who many of you already know. He gives lectures here quite often, and he's been at CSI teaching also. Most recently, the Idaho Humanities Council supported his presentation on Hemingway, which I hope you didn't miss. Let me add just a couple more things. I had these buttons made. They say, "Make it new," with a little symbol for the English pound. And make it new was kind of his motto, innovate. And that's what got me excited about him at the Blaine County Historical Museum, which I hope you go to. There's a wonderful exhibit there. One more thing, I printed out some of his early poetry and posted it over there on the wall. I encourage you, if you read something that moves you, just take it with you. And of course, if you've memorized the poem, I have a book for you. And now, here's Ted.
All right, thanks everybody, thanks for coming. You could have stayed home and watched any number of illuminated screens instead of coming here. So I want to thank you for joining us all. And I also want to say shout out to all the people who are not here, who are going to see this later. It's really strange to give a presentation to people who aren't here, and I'm gradually getting used to that. But there's going to be other people seeing it later, and that's also a great way to double check on these presentations. I'm here to talk about Ezra Pound and the legacy of Italian fascism, but first of all, this series was prompted by a little dust up relative to the awarding of a scholarship. And the name of Ezra Pound was a controversial. Now, fortunately for us, everything had a happy ending because we found another organization, namely the Haley Chamber of Commerce, who would present the scholarship in Ezra Pound's name. So, but it did highlight a difficulty we as a community are having in relationship to our most famous son, Ezra Pound, born here in October of 1885. He is, and I think what we're trying to do is, and I said this earlier to Chamber of Commerce group, it's very important that we forge a constructive relationship to Ezra Pound as a community, or somebody else will define his relationship to us for themselves. So, as part of the process of establishing that, we decided Jennifer mainly decided to promote this series to educate people on Ezra Pound. I've found that people who, to the extent they know about him at all, don't see him as a poet. And unfortunately, Ezra Pound is in serious need of public relations work, as Jennifer just mentioned. So, first of all, I'd like to bring attention to the award winner of the 2023 Ezra Pound Scholarship. It's Ayman Allen. He's sitting over there. Could you stand up, Ayman? Let's give it up for Ayman. Ayman is heading to Yale this summer to study psychiatry, and I've tasked him with the responsibility of explaining me to myself once he gets back. Yeah, he's got some serious work ahead of him. So anyway, we have also, this is the first of 3 presentations. My job tonight is to talk about Ezra Pound and to address the elephant in the room, which is namely Pound's relationship to Italian fascism. But we have 2 more speakers. This is a 3-speaker event on 3 subsequent nights. And so I would like to introduce you briefly to our other speaker. The speaker for tomorrow is Robert von Hallberg. He's a professor at McKenna Claremont College in California, and his latest book is Monogamy, Its Songs and Poems. He's going to be talking tomorrow night about Pound's poetry, mainly Canto 45. So I'd like to, where's Robert? Could you, there he is. Come and see him tomorrow. And the final speaker in our 3-speaker series is, he's the research professor at the University of New Orleans and the director of the Ezra Pound Center for Literature in Brunenburg, Italy. He's also a poet himself, and nobody does more work for Ezra Pound and his legacy than Dr. John Geary. He too will be lecturing on Pound's poetry. One of the problems we have with Ezra Pound is no one seems to know that he's a poet. He ends up, being accused and called many different things. Poet isn't one of them. And so part of our task is to help us come to some terms with his actual achievement as a cultural figure and as a poet. And of course, the way to do that is to come to terms with his legacy, which regrettably is this. First of all, let me say, before we get going on, that we do not support fascism or anti-Semitism in any way, shape, or form. This is an explanation of Pound's relationship to those phenomena. Unfortunately, when people say Ezra Pound, this is what we think of, what they think of. And really, Pound knew the power of an image. And boy, are these powerful symbols. They are alive and well. I bet some of you felt that twinge in your stomach when you saw some of these things. The swastika, it used to be an Aztec symbol of renewal. It's been, shall we say, repurposed by Goebbels, and the swastika, especially, when it's given its red background, is a symbol that will live in infamy. How many times have you seen a biker wearing the red cross, the iron cross, excuse me? Also, for me at least, that's the symbol of the Waffen-SS, 2 lightning bolts. And those are German soldiers with the Waffen-SS insignia. Now, the Waffen-SS is, I've always, as a kid, I was a World War II nut. I destroyed the gardens of several of my friends' mothers, reenacting crucial battles of World War II. I've been a serious reader of World War II stuff my entire life, and for some reason, World War II is alive and well in my psyche in ways that I cannot explain. But there's a lot of problems with that. We have to understand, first of all, we're going to talk about fascism tonight, and we're going to come, hopefully, to a definition of what fascism is so we can think about and see fascism in a little clearer way than we traditionally do. Also, we're going to learn that there are many fascisms. See, the problem is when we say fascism, we think of this. This is fascism for almost all of us. And so there's a sentence that goes like this: fascism, which of course means exclusively German fascism, fascism plus the final solution equals ultimate evil. And it's something that exists. Talking about that, even investigating that or examining it in any way is a kind of taboo. People, A, do not wish to revisit the first half of the 20th century because it was a nightmare. Secondly, there's all the ghosts of World War II. I think each and every person in this room has a World War II story. World War II produced 65 million casualties. If you add that to the 20 million casualties of World War I, we ended with 85 million casualties, war casualties, in a 30-year period. Human beings have never confronted that much destruction in their entire history. So it's no wonder people don't want to talk about this. I was going to share with you briefly my own World War II story. My father graduated from high school in the spring of 1944, just in time for D-Day, the entire European theater, and the battles in Japan. He went, in the early summer, he went to basic training. He was trained with flamethrowers, and he was trained to be a member of the initial waves invading the islands of Japan. Now, while he was ready to ship out, within days, Truman dropped the atomic bomb. Now, had Truman not dropped the atomic bomb, you would be hearing a lecture from somebody else, because I wouldn't be here. My father's chance of surviving was just about nil. And casualties for the invasion of the Japanese islands were anywhere between 250,000 and 1 million. So I have skin in the game when people say, well, no one should have dropped the atomic bomb. I say, wait a minute, my very existence is at stake. And so that's an example of the ghosts that we all have and things that we all feel. And Americans suffered over 416,000 casualties in World War II. I believe 120 in World War I. So, on that cheery note, I understand when people don't want to talk about it. And when I'd show up in a library in southern Idaho, and I would make a statement like, Benito Mussolini was a very skilled politician. Someone would say, wait a minute, my uncle died in the fighting of Italy. How dare you? Or if I would say something like that, Goebbels was a very effective minister of propaganda for the Third Reich. People would say something like this, you're praising these Nazi monsters? How dare you? And as you can see, my little speech would pretty much crumble at that point. And I'd finish up wondering if someone was going to jump me in the parking lot on the way home. But I'm saying all this to you by way of making the case that I'm asking for your indulgence tonight. If I say something that I'm probably going to say things that might pull you out of your comfort zone, or I might say things that sound really strange. And so we're going to have to, if you would be so kind as to accept that from me, then we can examine this question of Pound and his connection to Italian fascism. Anyway, enough of that. I've got through most of my notes. Enough of these symbols. We're going to start here with the elephant in the room. It's the relationship of Mussolini and Hitler. Now, everybody thinks, since fascism is German fascism, they forget the fact that fascism was created by Benito Mussolini. Hitler became chancellor in 1933, and he wasn't really dictator until 35-ishly. And during this time, it was Mussolini who invented fascism, who was the model of European politics. We forget that, first of all, there was hundreds of Mussolini copycats throughout the world. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Comintern created something called the blue shirts to copy Mussolini. We have hundreds of dictators and would-be dictators who followed Mussolini, including Adolf Hitler, who had a bust of Mussolini in his office. We are coming upon the 100th anniversary of the beer hall Munich putsch. I believe it's this November. Prior to that, Hitler wrote a fan letter to Mussolini, but he never got a reply. I assume he wanted an 8x12 autographed glossy, but nothing was forthcoming. But then again, the news got as many as 300 pieces of mail a day, so there's lots of people he didn't respond to. What happened in 1934 was that Hitler wanted to come down and try to make his pitch to Mussolini for the takeover of Austria. The whole thing was doomed from the start. First of all, Mussolini always overestimated his linguistic abilities. He taught himself French and German, but he couldn't deal with Hitler's Austrian accent. And I guess there was a problem with the Italian translator for Hitler. First of all, we'll notice here that Hitler shows up in a business suit. He's there, hat in hand. He looks like a guy who sells life insurance door to door. And this didn't look well. Guess who this photo op is stolen by Mussolini. He's got the military body language, the elbow out. He's looking nice and relaxed. And of course, he's got the black shirt. We'll talk about black shirts. Now, I talked about the SS and their uniforms and their presence. Well, guess who else had a black shirt? It was what was called the Arditi, which was the shock troops, Italian shock troops, on whom Mussolini's uniform was modeled. And by the way, he wears a funny hat. People always think that that hat is really weird. It looks like, what, a casserole dish or something? I mean, what's that? Well, it's something called a fez. This is something that the Ottoman Turks wore. I mention this because there's a whole aspect to our story that deals with the Ottoman Empire, that is our Middle East, and Eastern Europe. We think of Italy as a Western European nation, and it is, but Italy is towards the eastern end of the Mediterranean. They have much history with what's used to be called Yugoslavia, and with what then, in the early days, was the Ottoman Turks. So, Hitler says in their meeting, he basically jumps up and says, it's the destiny of the German people to take over Austria. And Mussolini jumped up and said, like bleep it is. We do not like, Austria-Hungary has been one of our ancestral enemies. We do not want a militarized state on our borders, so forget about it. And then it just degenerated from there. They stood up and yelled at each other. Their staffs were all nervous. This really got off to a bad start. The worst thing after the screaming match was they had to make nice for a couple days, you know, at dinners and speeches and stuff. So this is a terrible thing. Mussolini went back to Berlin with his tail, Hitler went back to Berlin with his tail between his legs, and he decided, well, maybe I'll wait for my Austrian plans. Basically, Mussolini said to his aides, he's a silly little man, isn't he? And Hitler was so angry that a year later, when Mussolini invaded what is now Ethiopia, Hitler sent aid to the Ethiopians. So this did not get off to a good start. And of course, basically, Mussolini had no toleration for this Aryan race nonsense. He said, you know, Imperial Rome was at its glory while you Aryan people were running around in loincloths and spears in the dead of winter in northern Germany. Get off it. Hitler didn't particularly like that. So much for that. But anyway, this is the start of a relationship, and there was a way in which their relationship grew, mainly because there was no one else for them to rely on. But the vexing issue of Mussolini and Hitler is something that it continues. We'll get to that in a second. Anyway, this is what Hitler learned from Mussolini. Guess who knows how to present a military bearing at a parade? Guess who has the martial body language? And of course, there's the fez again. Now, it's time to get going here with our guy, Benito. Yeah, I'm glad you laughed, because that is his police mugshot. Mussolini he got busted in Switzerland many times. He had a police record by the time he was in his 20s. He was born in 1883 in the northeastern half of Italy. His father was a fervent socialist. He was a blacksmith. His mother was a devout Roman Catholic. And so he picked up socialism right from the get-go. And he was actually named after some of his father's favorite socialists in Mexico and elsewhere. Problem is young Benito was not a very charitable child. He got kicked out of the first school he went to twice. He got in arguments with his schoolmates and stabbed them with penknives. He would also physically attack members of the staff that he didn't get along with. He also admitted later he stabbed one of his girlfriends. So what are we to do with people like this? I mean, this man, however, was quite charismatic, and he thought himself an intellectual and educated himself, and he's quite well read. Also, he got his teaching certificate in 1901. He taught grade school. Can you imagine sending, little Johnny and Deborah to his class? Now, I tried to research. I wanted to find out if he had any evaluations. What was his career like? What did people think of him as a teacher? I couldn't find anything that would be reputable. And I've often wondered about this. I mean, maybe he would be the kind of person, given his own troubled youth, that he might have been the kind of teacher who could deal with, troubled children effectively. whatever it was, he was quite charismatic. He, in order to avoid military service, because he wasn't, as a socialist, he wasn't a big fan of the government, as a young man, he went to Switzerland, went across the border, where he became a radical socialist agitator. He got in trouble with the Swiss authorities, hence the mugshot. He also got kicked out of a couple countries. He was also arrested for forging his papers. So this is, let's say, this is not a promising start in life. But by the second decade of the 20th century, he was the editor of Avanti magazine, which is a socialist magazine, and he was a smashing success as a newspaper editor. He elevated the circulation from about 20,000 to 100,000. He was a great journalist by every standard. He was also a great administrator. He could deal with journalistic egos. He could also earn the respect of Marxists and socialists everywhere for his subtle and nuanced understanding of Marxism. He was a star. He also never renounced violence. As an editor, he had a cache of weapons in his office. How many newspaper editors do you know that store weapons in their office? Well, you know, it's Italy. You know, what can I say? Anyway, everything was going along swimmingly, except that in that run-up to World War I, he decided that Italy should join the war, and the socialist position was Italy should remain neutral. Now, the Allied powers, in order to court Italy, offered the Italians all kinds of properties in what was then soon to become Yugoslavia. Mussolini agitated for this and got kicked out of the Socialist Party. So, now people often say, oh, this is crass opportunism. He bailed on the socialists. But I think what happened at this crucial period in time, Mussolini didn't, there was a widespread feeling that Marxism had failed insofar as working people by the millions signed up for the slaughter of World War I. Mussolini came to see somehow and in some way that the proper direction was not socialism with its transnational outlook. You know, in other words, the proletariat is what the workers should be loyal to, whether that proletariat is in Italy or Germany or everywhere. Anyway, he switched. So that's an interesting aspect in his life. Anyway, so Mussolini joins the army. I got some pictures of him. We'll come back to the fascist guy. We'll talk to him. Here's some. Oh, this is the wrong picture. This is the Arditi. I'll come back to them. Anyway, there we go. I have some pictures of the young Mussolini. Of course, this is the famous. This became iconic. It became a template in Italian propaganda. That's Mussolini as a young soldier. He was a good soldier, like he was a good editor. He got commendations for his bravery and coolness under fire. And he was badly injured by, I think it was a mortar shell. He got filled with shrapnel. And while at the front, he also contracted typhoid fever. So he was in 2 of the battles of the Isonzo. I think there were 7. I keep losing track of how many battles of the Isonzo there was. But he came back to his job as editor of Avanti as a war veteran. So, we're back. That's the first member of the founding fathers of fascism. Let me go back. Mussolini, and of course what we're talking about here is the aftermath of World War I. This was an absolute disaster, and we'll talk about that a little bit if I have time. I got to be careful of my time. This are pictures of what was called the Arditi. An Ardito was considered to be an audacious individual. The Arditi was a group of specially trained Italian shock troops. In order to break the impasse in the trenches, the Arditi cut the wires and snuck up during their own bombardment, and they jumped the Austro-Hungarians in their trenches. Now, most of the time in a World War I attack, you know, the soldiers endured a horrifying bombardment. Many of them, you know, lost their hearing in these bombardments. Many of them were nauseous and vomiting. Many of them were half unconscious. It took them kind of an hour to get themselves together and to get their equipment set up. The Italians realized the best time to get them was right away. And the problem, of course, is lots of these Arditi were killed by their own artillery. Nonetheless, the Arditi and their knives, we see the knife right there, and this armor was to protect them from the blasts of their own artillery and from the blasts of shockwaves of their own grenades, but it didn't work very well, so they got rid of these uniforms. This is an Arditi dress uniform. Oops. Anyway, after the war, these men typified Italian masculinity and the Italian future. The regular army was hopelessly demoralized, you know. 450,000 dead and 1 million wounded, that'll demoralize an army. But these people were fighters, and the returning soldiers, and especially the returning Arditi, were fundamental in the foundation of fascism. So there's a sense in which that fascism was the creation of World War I veterans. That's really kind of true. Anyway, the other founding father is Tommaso Marinetti. He's quite the character. He invented something called futurism. Pound knew him in England because he was part of the Vorticist movement. And he was quite a famous avant-garde intellectual of the teens and the 20s. He was an unsparing critic of Italy. But Mussolini valued him. I love this quote. He wrote an essay called The Manifesto Against Past-Loving Venice, filling the small stinking canals with the rubble from the old collapsing palaces. That's about how he viewed. He said, museums is where culture goes to die. He said Italy doesn't produce any, he hated tourists because Italy was covered every year with all these people visiting it for its cultural treasures. He says, you know, he's tired of these people, and Italy produces nothing but tour guides. He says the Italian people need to get going, they need to get with it. Their model is not the ancient anything, it has to do, we need to craft an aesthetics based on modern technology. He was, of course, a fervent patriot and nationalist. He himself was badly wounded. He was an officer. He suffered terrible injuries, spent a year recovering, re-upped, went back to the front, and participated in the final battle of the war. By the way, Marinetti, in his golden years, at age 65, joined the Italian troops fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front. Isn't that how you'd like to spend your golden years? And he captures, in a way, a lot of the manic despair of the post-World War I world. But he was a charismatic person, and Mussolini thought he was, you know, it's essential to the movement. Now just think of it. We've got Mussolini and his police record. We've got this guy, and we've got the Arditi. Now, currently there's a lot of criticism about the American founders in our culture, but compared to these guys, our founding looks pretty darn good. So, who would have bet that a political movement created by Marinetti, Mussolini, and a bunch of angry soldiers would be one of the most powerful political ventures of the 20th century? Not too many. Okay, so I've got a map here. This is a map on the right. It's kind of multicolored. I've got my cool little pointer. See this? Uh-oh. Oh, there it is. This is a map of Italy in about 1600s. When Mussolini came to power, first of all, I like this map for a lot of reasons. One is here's the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire, for our viewers, it's right towards the middle. You can see how close it is to Italy. Northern Italy has got a bunch of these tiny little states. This is a Renaissance map, of course. In the middle is the papal states, and at the bottom is pretty much the agricultural part of Italy. Now, Italy remade itself about the time our union was coming apart in 1861. Theirs was coming together. Italian patriots, Giuseppe Mazzini and Garibaldi fought. They created something called the Risorgimento, was the resurgence in nationalist Italian identity. When Mussolini came to power, he still found a badly fractured Italy. And he faced his first movement as El Duce, the leader, was concerned education. And anyway, illiteracy was about 20% in the industrial north and about 50% in the agricultural south. Furthermore, there were so many dialects of Italian that people in Italy couldn't understand each other. He faced the daunting problems. And also, but there was, starting in the mid-19th century, a sense of nationalist feeling. There's also a sense among the Italian people, we were used to be the Roman Empire. Our history includes the grandeur, the Renaissance. What happened to us? How did we get in this mess? Mussolini had an answer to those questions. Mussolini was not an intellectual. He was not a cultured man per se. He had the mind of a marketer and a public relations specialist. And he had an uncanny feeling for the mood of the people. And his brand of nationalism caught on. Now, there's lots of problems. Mainly that it was made possible by street thugs. The Arditi in their black uniforms became the black shirts. And Mussolini, after his march on Rome in, I think it's December of 1922, was made prime minister and quickly became emperor. But it was based on street aggression and street violence. I'm going to come back to this map. This is the map of Italy's conquest, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Oh yeah, here's some real cool architecture. First of all, we have to remember that part of the genius, so to speak, forgive me for calling him, but Mussolini co-opted the intelligentsia, the arts community, the education community, and celebrities. He made fascism cool. It was chic. Check out that building. It looks, actually, to me, that looks like something from the Jetsons cartoon. But that's modernism. Who else? What other dictator would build a state building that looks like that? And that was a fascist museum. And up here, you see a collage. This is a whole bunch of collage-style exhibits in the modernist mode. And this is Mussolini with his shirt off. This is him building at various places. He would always like to go to dig sites. He was everywhere doing everything. And that was part of his thing. His message, his political appeal was wherever was something going on, Mussolini popped up there. He seemed to have unlimited energy. Okay. This is my favorite. I got a bunch of pictures to show you here about fascist Italy. I'm trying to give everyone a sense of what it felt like to be there. This is my favorite. Can you imagine Stalin building a building like this? But this is his headquarters. Now, how many times can you say the word yes in Italian? But I think that's cool. I mean, I really like that. But that's the style of Italian fascism. This is young boys wearing a fez. These are grade schools. The fascist was very concerned with educating the young. They had crippling illiteracy to deal with. And like any totalitarian, they knew they had to propagandize the young to survive, and they did that very effectively. So here's the boys with their guns. They're grade schoolers. So of course they have guns. Didn't you have guns when you were in grade school? Here's the adults. They graduated to automatic weapons. And this are the girls exercising. See, there was no such thing as individualism in Italy. It was a corporate expression. That is to say, you identified as a member of a group. And they were very successful. These are people about Ezra Pound's daughter's age, and they were fervent fascists. If you were born in Italy in the late teens, early 20s, these were some of the most committed fascists, were the young people. And this is one of my favorite pictures. It's hard to see in this photo, but those are the adoring crowds. That's a picture from behind Mussolini. We have no idea how popular he was. His early admirers were Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. He got great press. He was the man who made the trains run on time. The bustle of Franklin Roosevelt in the early years of his administration was, to a degree, something that Roosevelt saw in Mussolini. He saw how Mussolini, from the mess of the post-World War I era, he could see how to galvanize the electorate. Non-stop action. The first 100 days of the Roosevelt, well, that's something that came about. We still talk about the first 100 days of an administration. That's something that's defined by Roosevelt, and it's something that came from his style. Not that, I'm not saying Franklin Roosevelt was a fascist, please. But anyway, Mussolini was also, well, he was, I've got too many things in my head. I'll keep going here. This is the symbol of the fascia. This was a Roman symbol. It was a one stick that was one wrapping around a bundle of sticks. The corporatist structure of the fascist government was something that was based on 19th century sorts of theory. That is to say, the government consisted of workers and working groups, rather than, the Department of Homeland Security and the Chamber of Commerce. We had doctors and lawyers, we had steel workers, we had teachers, we had lawyers and doctors. In other words, the cabinet meeting looked like a union meeting in a way. This is something that he borrowed from his socialist days and socialist ideals of guild socialism. Part of the effect was, though, that every working person in Italy could look to the government and see somebody in their profession. Somebody they knew who was doing what they were doing was in some kind of decision-making capacity in the government. Now, the Italian government didn't work well as an industrial empire, and we'll get to that in a second. But this is part of the appeal. See, in capitalism, the industrialists just ran roughshod over the workers. They trashed them. They drove them into the party, paid the ground, paid them nothing. Here, workers were in the government. Is that cool or what? Well, everything was good. Well, actually, Mussolini in the early years really had trouble. He came to power in 1922. The first 4 or 5 years were a little bit rugged. Namely, there was all kinds of scandals, and there was difficulties with the left. His old buddies on the left hated him. He was a turncoat, he was a traitor, and we have to remember that the left was extremely popular in Italy all through this time period and beyond. One of the interesting things, a sidelight to the whole Italian story, after World War II and the first elections in 1948, the repurposed OSS, now known as the CIA, was tasked with the charge of getting the Christian Democrat Party elected. The problem was everybody wanted to have a communist government in Italy. Well, we got some money out of the Marshall Plan. We got all kinds of. We created the Christian Democrat Party, and we helped the Italians oversee the elections. And so, guess who didn't win the 1948 election? It was the communists. Well, Mussolini was facing the same kind of dynamics. No matter how photogenic he was, no matter how many parades, no matter how much cool artwork he put up, the left was still bugging him. This guy, Giacomo Matteotti, was a very educated and very articulate man who took on Mussolini in a direct way. He just scorched him, torched him. You're a bum, you're a thief, I'm sick of your thugs, and so on. Well, Mussolini showed him. As the old mafia joke has it, he slipped in the shower and fell on some bullets. He disappeared, and of course, Benito had plausible deniability. Gosh darn it, what happened to him? I really liked him. And so, but that still didn't work, so this is what we get instead. This is the fascist secret police. Created in 1927, but probably it was started a little bit earlier. This is how, the problem was this street violence thing was wearing on the Italian people. The Italian people actually seemed to have a pretty wholesome response. I sort of came to like them in the process of my research. But they said, this is too much. You can't be killing people. This is an educated man. We need people on our side. You can't, So, okay. So he does it this way. Suddenly the secret police are everywhere taking account of everything. They were not even acknowledged publicly till 1930. Also during this time, Mussolini worked out a deal with the Catholic Church. He gave them separate autonomy and compensated them for what they considered to be the theft of Rome, thereby disappearing the papal states that we saw on that earlier map. But he filled the Vatican with his spies. If the Pope had an extra cube of sugar in his tea, Mussolini knew about it. Also, the secret police was part of every fascist organization, and every aspect of Italian life was part of the fascist organization. Suddenly, Italy became peaceful. And this is the pinnacle of his power. There was a kind of golden age, pardon the expression. See, this is what gets me in trouble in Southern Iowa. Golden age! So anyway, there's a kind of golden age between 1928 and 1935 where Mussolini's at the top of his game. He's a star internationally. He is the bulwark against communism. He's proof that we can get our economies running. Yes?
Is this a lecture about Mussolini or Ezra Pound?
We'll get to Ezra Pound. This is right now an extra. We have to know who Mussolini is before we can talk about Ezra Pound. This is the issue of the death camps. Only a small percentage of course, only a small number of people perished who, well, the race laws in '38 came into being, and no one liked them. The Italian people hated these race laws. No one wanted to tear apart the Jews. No one wanted to separate them from their place in Italian society. Also, there was no, all throughout the world, the Italian military refused to give up Jews. They figured that out, and they went to Italian military areas and stayed there. So this is, the Italians as anti-Semites is not true. And so when we talk about Ezra Pound and his attachment to Italian fascism, we're talking about a people who aren't inherently anti-Semitic. They're certainly not genocidal. Okay, this is Mussolini and Franco. I'll talk about Franco in a little bit when we talk about Franco and we talk about what is. Now, this is maybe a segment here on the Ustascia. This is something that perhaps, given my time limitations, I can do without. The point of this, the Ustascia was a radical fascist group that emerged in Croatia and they were unspeakably brutal. They, 20 days after the creation of the Ustascia's Croatian state. We can see over here, Croatia was in the yellow, and Bosnia-Herzegovina is the green. Hitler redrew it so that Bosnia-Herzegovina was in the boundaries of the Ustascia fascist state, and 20 days after their founding, they began murdering Serbs. They had approximately 2 million Serbs in their territory. They had a policy concerning Serbians. We'll kill a third of them, we'll deport a third of them, and we'll make the final third convert to Roman Catholicism. So this is the hero. I'll get back to this. This is the definition here of fascism. Now, I wanted to go back before I start give you a little biographical snippet of Pound. See, we have to know who Mussolini is before we can understand Pound's connection to him. Where's my map? My map, where's my map? Well, World War II was a nightmare for the Italians. That's when everything came apart. Ezra Pound came to Italy in 1924. We know that there's an aspect of his life, much of the more interesting aspects of his life occurred before he moved to Italy. He left for Venice in 1908. He was a teacher at Wabash College in Indiana. He got into serious trouble when the maids in his boarding house found in his bed a woman who was a member of the local vaudeville troupe. Apparently, they'd had difficulties with bad weather. He said, sure, come over to my place, and this is a big scandal. Pound got in trouble, and he got kicked out. Well, he didn't get kicked out. He got in serious trouble and said, I'm leaving. I've had it with this nonsense, and I'm going to Europe, where I'm going to hang out with the best poet in the English-speaking world once I get there. Pound goes to Venice with a clutch of his own poems, which he publishes. He goes to London, in that period, I think he arrives in 1909. He is well reviewed as a poet. He becomes a mover and a shaker, and he becomes an intimate of William Butler Yeats and other people. He has what looks like a promising career. But what comes along? Well, World War I comes along. He had created a movement called Vorticism, which was partially based on marionnetti. He basically, he launches Vorticism a few weeks before the start of World War I. His entire movement is obliterated, and he loses people like his good friend, the sculptor Henry Gautier Bresca, was killed in Flanders in 1915. Pound was devastated. He also suffered from the intense post-war disillusion that all the Italians we've talked about experienced. Suddenly, England wasn't a great place for him. Suddenly, he really disliked the post-World War I order that was emerging. Pound leaves. He spends a few years in Paris, roughly 3 intermittently, but he travels a lot during that phase. And in 1924, he comes to Italy, the town of Rapallo, and stays there for the rest of his life. Remember, Pound was educated as a philologist. He studied the history of language. He was multilingual, and he was particularly interested in the Romance languages, which are the language that developed after the fall of the Roman Empire, namely French, Spanish, to some extent Portuguese, and then little bits of German, and of course Italian. And he found in Italy the environment that he wished to have. That is to say, he found in Mussolini someone whose vision of what culture was functioned in lockstep with his own. We always have to remember that Pound's view of politics, like his view of literature, was highly individualistic. Ezra Pound created his own literary canon. He had his own distinct ideas, his own distinct ideas of what economics should be, which led him, unfortunately, into his anti-Semitic period. But also, he was quite happy where he was, and he became a supporter of the Mussolini regime. Now, there were some other extenuating factors about Pound's time in Italy, because he eventually he worked for the Department of Fascist Propaganda. His parents moved with him to Italy, and just before the last Americans were to leave Italy before the Second World War, Homer Pound broke his hip. Pound was stuck in Italy. Homer died in 1942, but his mother lived on. And all of a sudden, both Ezra and Dorothy Pound lost contact with all their financial resources, which were in England. Pound needed to work. He desperately wanted, and he was a very enthusiastic supporter of his work in fascist propaganda. The Italians didn't know what to do with him. They thought he was a really crazy guy with funny hair who talked about Confucius all the time, and they didn't know if he was a spy or not. Is this code? What's this guy about? But he finally ingratiated himself and was quite successful. I was going to talk about the issues surrounding World War II. I'll summarize these a bit. Everything would have been great for Mussolini and for Ezra Pound, but for the invasion of what is now Ethiopia in 1935. Mussolini went from being the star of the international world to being a thug. Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. He dropped mustard gas on them, the Ethiopian Italian tribesmen. He blew up their Red Cross centers and their Red Cross ambulances. He used flamethrowers. He was brutal. It was a human rights disaster, and it was a public relations disaster. Also, it destabilized the political order of Europe. Now, this is what brought Mussolini and Hitler together in their fatal embrace. But from Pound's point of view, this could have been a time in which he got off the train, but he didn't. He doubled down. He was committed. And as things darkened, as World War II began, Mussolini was very impressed with Hitler's war machine in 1938. By the fall of France in 1940, he thought Hitler's victory was inevitable. I want a seat at his negotiating table. He was all in with Hitler. and he didn't have the industrial capacity to compete. The Italians suffered one military disaster after another, which maybe I'll talk about at another time. So let me go back. It takes me a while to circle through these. Ezra Pound's position gets more and more perilous. That is to say, the cultural period of Mussolini's ascendancy is eliminated by the needs of the war and the war economy. Suddenly, art is not such a big deal. Suddenly, the working class is not such a big deal. And suddenly, Ezra Pound is in a bad position. Now, I'm going to get to this one. And the whole aspect, this is a great quote from Pound. Never was the life of the arts so obviously and conspicuously intermingled with the life of power. For Ezra Pound, Mussolini was the embodiment of a Renaissance duke and art patron. He saw Mussolini in Renaissance terms, not so much in fascist terms. He loved him as a man of action. Like everybody else, he was happy that the trains ran on time. But there's all kinds of things that have to do. The national embrace of the avant-garde, this is inconceivable in England, and not even in France. But Marionetti was one of the founding fathers. Ezra Pound knew Marionetti. This is great stuff. Like everybody in Italy, he got to see people in his profession in positions of power and authority. And of course, the whole idea of the Roman and the Renaissance past. Pound loved classical literature. He created his cantos on the model of Homer and Dante, and he dearly loved the Renaissance. And so did Mussolini. So, the forms of the Italian past were continually brought up as history was emphasized. Now, what Ralph Waldo Emerson said, he talked about the dead hand of the past. He wanted Americans to create something entirely new and escape from European models. Ezra Pound was interested in escaping the dead hand of the present. He loved old European models. He shaped and developed his art based upon them. He saw them as a priceless international resource. That was his interest in the Chinese, interested in all kinds of cultures. And then why he loved Confucius so much. Here is another previous past system that we can employ. And for Ezra Pound, the job of an artist was to recreate a Renaissance. That's what you were supposed to do. Sit in your apartment and write poems condemning General Motors and then live by yourself. No, you're in the mix in the same way. The fascists were in the public space. He has a Greek idea of social involvement. And so for Ezra Pound, Mussolini's government was precisely the vehicle for promoting the Renaissance he wanted to promote. So, what we have here is a sense of fascism that we probably don't recognize. Who thinks of the Renaissance like that? A fascism like that? Now, is your idea of Mussolini as a Renaissance art patron? Probably not. But Pound saw the world in a very individual way. And his own private vision of fascism was something that he cherished. Now, there's lots of problems to all. Did Pound repudiate his view? Well, no. He did express some regret over his anti-Semitic writings, but his sense of the fascist nation and the possibilities of what a Renaissance, a world made along the lines of Renaissance, that was something that he cherished, and he never gave up. But no one knows that's what he thought fascism was. So that's the main problem that we have when dealing with Pound. So anyway, I love this picture of him. He's upstairs in Shakespeare and Company. And the other aspect of Pound's life that I haven't had a chance to deal with, and also I haven't really had a chance to deal too much with his connection with Hemingway. Hemingway was another modernist writer who had a deep attachment to Italy. Although they were on opposite poles, Hemingway was to the left, and Ezra Pound, of course, was to the right. But During his time in London, he was what I call a midwife to modernism. Modernism became, in large part, what Ezra Pound wanted it to be. He discovered talents, namely T.S. Eliot. He edited The Wasteland, got it published. He was instrumental in the life of James Joyce. We wouldn't have James Joyce without him. So if anybody asks me about Pound and his contribution to arts and world literature, I send them to Hemingway's A Movable Feast. And in his chapter on Ezra Pound, he speaks with great elegiac affection for his old friend. Now, he blasted Pound for his work with Italian propaganda, but he still had feelings for Pound, and he was involved in getting Pound out of St. Elizabeth's. So that's the other aspect of Pound that's kind of outside the scope of our talk, but it's a very important thing to know. Now, in traditional terms, there's the so-called good Pound and the bad Pound. There's Pound the poet and the midwife to modernism, and there's Pound the fascist. So actually, they were all kind of one and the same thing. But Pound, like I said, we have to see what Pound meant by fascism. We'll move on here. This is an interesting thing. Wodehouse, everybody knows who P.G. Wodehouse was. P.G. Wodehouse was a comic English writer. And he was, let's say, he wasn't connected to the reality principle. He was, because he resented paying taxes, he was hanging out in the south of France, and he seemed to forget that the Germans were conquering the south of France, and they swept him up. And they said, PG, you're a great guy, and we're going to have you do some radio broadcasts. And PG says, oh, that's cool. So he broadcasts to America about how charming everything was in the south of France, even though the Nazis were here. Needless to say, all heck broke loose. But PG wasn't jailed. He was basically considered too clueless for jail. Oswald Mosley was a British fascist whom Ezra Pound wrote for in the 1930s. And Ezra Pound went to an event hosted by Mosley in Italy in 1961. They remained lifelong friends. So this is an interesting thing having to do with other people who spoke. Pound did not fare so well. So what happened to Pound as a result of his Italian foray? Well, everything bad happened for Ezra Pound. It was a disaster. He was indicted for treason in 1943. As soon as the Allied armies got there, he was arrested. There was one of the, I didn't get a chance to talk about this, one of the writers, Matthew Feldman, who is really a fine writer on Italian fascism and Ezra Pound that Dr. Gehry pointed me towards, said that there was a passport awaiting for Pound in the German embassy in Rome, but he didn't take it. He could have gone out the rat line and gone to South America with so many other Nazis, but he didn't do it. He went, with the Allied armies at his back. He walked back home. And our friend Benito is not done well after his disastrous performance in World War II. The Allies invade Italy, the Fascist Council, and the king deposes him. Mussolini is sent to basically a ski resort in northern Italy. Mussolini reaches out to Hitler. I don't feel safe. Hitler dispatches some commandos who rescue him in a daring midnight raid, and they established him. Hitler establishes him as a puppet governor in the northern state. Pound, ever the devoted follower, goes there to work in the propaganda department in the last days of the war in the so-called Salo Republic. Mussolini was caught trying to escape into Switzerland. Communist partisans found him, pulled him up against a wall, and shot him. They took his dead body and the dead body of his then mistress, Clara Petacci, drove them to Milan, where they were hung upside down on street posts outside of a gas station, and their corpses were desecrated. So there's a famous picture of the shattered bodies of Mussolini and his mistress, among other shattered bodies. And Hitler, who had only a few days to live, was determined that he would not share that same fate. But I think that, for Pound, the death of Mussolini was a real blow. Also, as we know, Pound was captured, thrown in jail with hardened criminals. He was locked up in the detention center in Pisa, consisting of what they called tiger cages, which was basically a cement slab with metal around it. He was blasted by the sun and the rain by the day and by Klieg lights at night. He suffered a nervous breakdown, was pulled out of his cage, and he got some medical attention. And it was there he wrote the Pisan cantos, which are probably the most accessible part of the cantos, for which he is justifiably famous. And he won a poetry award after he was incarcerated, which was quite controversial. This all happened in 1948. And that's a whole second phase of his life, his American reception after his time with fascism. But of course, for Pound, his reputation was destroyed. He was a fascist collaborator. He was a monster. And like I said in the early part of it, he was a Nazi. And he's been labeled that ever since. Also, he spent 12 years in a mental institution. This very gifted and bright man spent 12 years with a whole lot of people who couldn't wash themselves. And he was very much visited, though, by poets and all kinds of folks who came to see him. After he finally got out in 1958, Pound had always talked about coming back to Halle and visiting it. But after he got out, he just wanted to go home to Italy. And he stayed there for the rest of his life. He went first to Brunenburg, stayed with his daughter, and then he ended up, he died in Venice in 1972. But he spent the last 10 years of his life in a deep depression. And there's all kinds of things about those final years, what he should or shouldn't have done. Should he have apologized? Should he renounced the Holocaust? We don't know that Pound knew about the Holocaust. He has plausible deniability, even though it's likely at the Salo Republic he would see, finally, the Nazis had access to the Italian Jewish community in those final years, and they took advantage. Pound doubtless saw some of that, but we don't know that he knew about the Holocaust. We do know that in his final radio broadcast, which he never got to deliver, he advocated for a separate state for the Jewish people in Israel. Also, Pound worked with Jewish people all the time, especially the poet Louis Zukowsky. The question of his relationship to anti-Semitism is quite complicated. At the trial, he was declared mentally unfit. His lawyer basically said, if we go to trial in this political climate, he's a corpse. And so they declared him mentally unfit, and so he went to the booby hatch instead of the gallows. The problem was he lost power of attorney. For the rest of his life, he couldn't sign his own checks. He was dependent upon other people. Anyway, the question of his final years and of his depression and in his relationship, those are still very much open and dynamic questions. And I've done pretty well here. I've talked about an hour. I had to chop about a third. You just should have seen my original presentation. I probably could have gone on for a week. I had to remove Gabriele D'Annunzio, my favorite character in all of Italian history, but that's for another day. And I also wasn't able to talk about Hemingway. The Hemingway connection is a very powerful one, but alas, that'll have to wait for another day as well. So, I've rattled on. Oh, thank you. I've rattled on for an hour, and so we have some time left. It's question time, and here is Jennifer with the...
Kristen. It's Kristen.
What did I call you? Oh.
Sorry, you have to move his microphone.
Oh, what's wrong with it?
It was rubbing against your shirt, so...
Oh, no. I'm fearful of the fate of my online viewers. Okay, it's question time, and we have to wait for the microphone so that all our folks in computer land can hear us. Go ahead.
First of all, I wanted to...
Identify yourself, if you would.
Oh, yes. My name is Trenton Pennington. I've been living in Halle for about 2 years now, and I've been following this story with a lot of interest. And first of all, I wanted to thank you for your time to share with us this history of the relationship between Mussolini and Pound. I feel that it was very illuminating, very informative for me as an individual, and I hope for the rest of us that we learned quite a lot of new information as well. I did have a question. You mentioned during your presentation that Mussolini used cultural institutions, the education system, and co-opted the intelligentsia, and in a way sort of misrepresented the heritage of Italy for his own political power and gain.
Well, he's sort of massaged it into his own interpretation, yeah.
Right. And I think that really kind of raises questions, you know, given the praise that Pound had for Mussolini, the violence that Mussolini used to achieve power. In addition to, as you mentioned at the beginning, most people are unaware of Pound's work as a poet and his influence in literature. Most people, the popular opinion is he's a fascist supporter, he's a Nazi enabler, things like that. And as you mentioned at the end, there's even this open question of is he an anti-Semite or not? With all of these questions, what is the end goal of bringing his literature and poetry into the conversation when all of these other facts, including the fact that he used his art for propaganda to support a fascist, what is the point now of bringing that literature angle?
Well, that's an interesting question. Did everybody hear his comment? Okay. Well, this is the question that's really at the core of what we're doing here, and he's basically saying, okay, Pound might have written a few good poems, but is it worth it? And can we let him off the hook? Is his literature, was anything that he wrote or said or promoted worth? How do we weigh that against his participation with Mussolini? And I would answer that in several ways. First of all, we have to remember that Pound was a person who had a spiritual life. He was deeply committed to Greek mythology and Greek religious experience. He was very passionate about all kinds of Neoplatonism, and he had very distinct ideas about what politics was. And his real political ideal was Confucius. He is saying, practically speaking, that this Mussolini guy will do. I know, that there's lots of rough stuff that happens, but lots of rough stuff happens in all political structures. Also, the Renaissance power brokers were not sweethearts either. Now, the problem that we have is, does Pound's sense of what fascism is that enough to make him understandable and acceptable to us or not? Now, I hear you saying implicitly that the answer is no. That Pound's political sins are such that whatever his cultural contributions, it's just not enough to make up for all these mistakes. And boy, you're not alone in that point of view. But what do you think? I mean, having heard this presentation, do you feel that you can look more sympathetic? Go ahead. That you feel more sympathetically about Pound?
I feel that as people in a society, it's important that we pay attention to how our cultural institutions are used.
Okay, that's a good answer. Next, and who'd like to be next? Thank you, sir. Oh, thank you. I forgot about my computer viewers once again. He's saying that we have to be careful about how cultural institutions are used. And if I'm reading between the lines correctly, your answer to my question would be no. It's not worth it. That's what I hear you saying. Anyway, thank you so much. That was a great question. Next.
I'll get this side of the room and then the next side.
By the way, we can hang out. I'll hang out as long as you want to talk. So if you want to hang out afterwards, that's great. Go ahead, Dr. Halberer.
I don't think that I'm following up on the first question. There are different questions. One is, who was Pound as an intellectual? And he was a fascist, he was an anti-Semite, et cetera, et cetera. Who was Pound as a writer? It's not our prerogative to cancel him, unless that's what you want, cancel culture generally. The fact is that he established himself as a poet in such a way that younger poets cannot ignore Ezra Pound. He survives in the art. Yeah? It may seem immoral to you that that's the case, but you wouldn't want to not have a literary history which tracked what artists have actually done, what their achievements are. You wouldn't want to have that silenced in order to pronounce moral judgment on him as a person. I think it is right to pronounce judgment on him as a person and as an intellectual, and to say as an intellectual, a fiasco of a career. A brilliant guy who fell for gutter ideology. And how did that happen? There's much testimony to his brilliance from people who met him, and there's testimony to his brilliance in his writing. That's a fact. But he fell for this. Is he alone? Is he an aberration? Not exactly. Not the only intellectual, American intellectual, to be seduced by Mussolini. Not at all. Mussolini was popular with Americans in the 20s. And by the end of the 20s, he was less popular with them. And as Ted said, with the attack on Ethiopia, still less. But the fact is that Americans fell for his ability to bring order to Italy. And Pound did fall for it, and he was loyal and stupid and stuck with it the whole way and paid a price for it. And that's part of the history. But, like canceling or erasing that is bad because it misleads us. If he were erased, we would not be able to write the history of modern literature, to put it just simply. And lots of poets know that, and although they don't sympathize with Pound's politics, you find lots of echoes of Ezra Pound, people paying homage to Ezra Pound among younger poets still. Now, he is in literary history. He has survived in literary history. Is literary history moral history? No, it's not. Yeah? It's something else. Yeah?
Thank you. Thank you.
Ted, I don't really have a question as much as I would love to see you put up the definition of fascism slide that you had.
Oh,
And
I'd love to.
And then maybe espouse for us on that.
Okay, I'll just really quickly. Fascism is a term of opprobrium. It's an epithet. It's something we say when we're mad at someone. And a lot of times we don't define fascism because it's too useful left undefined. In other words, a fascist is someone whose politics are the opposite of mine. And Roger, this is Roger Griffin. He's the scholar of fascism. This is him as a young man. He just died in 2021. He taught at Oxford. Anyway, he talks about, this is scholar speak, so I'll have to, revolutionary, organic, transformative nationalist movement within a historic nation state or a nation conceived of as a race or ethnos. Well, that's a fancy way of saying that fascism is predicated on the very idea of a nation state, as opposed to the transnationalism of the left. In other words, for the orthodox Marxists, the issue is class conflict, and the proletariat is the proletariat no matter where it is. And ultimately, this is an ideology, that is Marxism, which transcends the nation state. It's redundant, it gets in the way, it starts wars. No, says Griffin, and he says the fascists are very concerned about the nation state and its heritage. And Mussolini's great achievement, says Griffin, is that he made right-wing ideology a quasi-religious expression. He basically created a penumbra around the nation state that contained religious overtones. Part of that was his genius in dealing with the Catholic Church. Although the content of church doctrine and his political content were quite different, they dovetailed based on their ritual and their dogma, their sacramental qualities. For an Italian citizen, fascism felt right, and nationalism felt right. And the Italian people wanted an Italy, and they'd been colonized and abused for centuries, and they wanted a chance to get back to their ancestral glory. And for Pound, that worked great. He agreed. He said, I love Italy. I love its traditions. I want you to come back too. So anyway, and then of course, it's a rebirth from a perceived period of decadence. I didn't get a chance to talk about Franco. Franco was not a fascist by definition because there was no rebirth. Franco recreated the monarchy in Spain. He didn't have to go back to another political system. He was a serious Roman Catholic. He simply got rid of Marxism and reinstated a medievalist Catholic Church in an extremely conservative Spanish orthodoxy. So that's how he was different. But this is a complicated subject, and most of the problem is fascism. The term fascism is like ketchup in a bad restaurant. It goes on everything. Think in the 1950s how the term commie or pinko was used. It's a slur. You're a pinko. And I love pinko. It's my favorite because you didn't have enough courage to be red, to be a real communism. You wanted to hide as a pinko. See, it's guilt by association rhetoric, and Griffin's goal is to have some kind of definitional rigor to what fascism is, so we can have adult conversations. I mean, was that good enough? We can talk some more if you want. Matthew Feldman, by the way, is absolutely brilliant. We didn't get a chance to look at his books, but he's lucid on fascism and Pound's connection to it. So anyway, any further comments?
Well, I always thought that in fascism there's a business corporate state relationship back and forth. Am I wrong in that?
The problem the fascists had is that they weren't capitalists. They weren't interested in free market capitalism, and they wanted to control and co-opt corporations, especially the military-industrial complex. Hitler watched Mussolini very carefully. He saw how Mussolini courted the industrialists, and he did the same. Hitler actually disbanded his SA, his brown shirts, and in order to placate the concerns of the industrial elite. So it's not a capital state, and it's not corporate in our sense of the terms, but of course they need these people to make war. But it's all about party. It's all about the total state. And there's no autonomy for business or anybody else, really.
I'm going to ask a question to our speaker and the other scholars in the room as well. I take your point, right, about communism as an internationalist movement, at least Leninism was, and at the late 19th and early 20th century was a more globalized world than most of the 20th century. But I can't help thinking, hearing about Pound, as a historian, right, history is a conversation with the present, I can't help thinking about the connections to the world we live in today. Because you didn't mention populism, and Mussolini was a populist, right? And we're living in a world where populism is ascendant. You could even maybe say neo-fascism is ascendant. And we live in a world where we're kind of retreating from globalization. And I wonder if Pound has a new kind of relevance, not that we should aspire, but in terms of seeing his fall into thuggery, which I think is what you use. If Pound is more relevant today, not necessarily saying I'm not attaching a positive or negative attachment to it. Just wondered what your thought was.
All right. Well, let me say just real quickly that populism is not fascism.
No, it's not, but they're connected.
No, I'm not so sure. This is a key point. See, this is essential. Populism, by Mussolini's standards, is okay as long as it's linked up with his particularly party-centered outlook. To say someone who's a populist, is William Jennings Bryant a fascist? He's a populist. Well, there's all kinds of populists. I mean, you're basically saying right-wing populists fascists. That's what I'm hearing you say. Is that correct?
Populists on the left as well.
Okay,
yeah.
But are you saying populism as a phenomena is linked to fascism in some manner?
I'm saying
Or potentially.
fascism and populism became part of movements in the early 20th century.
Oh, populism is a long-standing thing that changes by cultural
in
context.
the late 19th century in the United States,
Well,
globally.
all over the place at all times. Anyway, this is I would say, in my view, and you see what you see what you think, is that this idea linking right-wing populism with fascism is itself a left-wing talking point. In other words, it's a way of saying that populist candidate A is really a fascist. And populism, like free market stuff, that is antithetical to fascism. So I would say no.
I'm just saying that populism there's a populism on the left and there's a populism on the right.
And I would say populisms don't have anything to do with totalitarianism, either on the left or the right. Now, you may disagree. I'm sorry, I don't mean to upset you, but I'm a student of Griffin. Okay, Griffin really gives clarity to this conversation. And so and Matthew Feldman has a great book where he edits some of his essays. And I think that's important stuff for us, because we're stuck in the same left-right divide that tore the world apart in the interwar years. Our political dialogue is gotten pretty tedious and pretty poisonous lately. And it shares a lot of what happened between the right and the left between the world wars. And fortunately, I didn't have time to talk a lot about the aftermath of World War I. Maybe next time. Anyway, thank you so much. I hope I answered your question. Anybody else like to speak?
Any other questions?
Any comments?
I guess not.
Pardon? Hungry. The country or your stomach?
Did you have something you wanted to say, sir?
Mr. Gary.
I think an important thing to remember or to be cognizant of is this, in the early question, assumption about the relationship between art and politics, in which art is cast as sort of secondary to politics. And I think part of the effort of Ezra Pound as a demonstration is that he doesn't make that kind of distinction. That to him, there is not that sense. He's not really a propagandist, even if he's writing under the Mussolini government. If you, in the radio speeches, he says he is an American speaking on behalf of free speech, and he's speaking that he's not being influenced by anybody but himself. And the question of, should we ignore the poetry of someone if his politics are in such a way, would theoretically say we could do the other thing. Should we ignore the politics when the poetry is another way? Because if you look at them, I mean, if you look at what the function or what the presence of art is in our lives, part of the political atmosphere is to suggest that the politics is more important than the art, and that we have to argue the politics, we have to contrast the politics, we have to come up with some sort of right answers, and then the art falls in there somewhere in between. But when Ezra Pound was a young man, he declared to himself, for better or worse, and this maybe you can accuse him of, he said, by the time I'm 30, I wanted to know more about poetry than anybody else in the world. That was his obsession. And then that took him to music, it took him to drama, it took him to sculpture, it took him to every other kind of art that became engaging with him. He transformed, in some ways, the nature of translation from other languages. He is as controversial among translators as he is among political commentators, because he decided to translate in a different way, and the traditional translators thought this was outrageous. How could somebody translate Latin and not do it the same way people have been doing it for thousands of years? And yet, that conversation still goes on because the way he thought about translation has so influenced all the other translators that now they have to take into account that sometimes there's something other than a word-by-word connection to bring across a text for what it's really saying. And so those, I mean, all I'm trying to suggest is that not to diminish the importance of the conversation about politics, but not to let ourselves fall into the same kind of dichotomies in which we weigh politics as the be-all and end-all. And maybe on Wednesday, or was it Thursday, I'll talk about that a little bit, because if you look through historically, you know, the poet Horace was sent into exile. Dante left Florence and never returned because of politics. And if you go around Italy today, people don't go, well, we don't want to mention Dante anymore because after all, he was on the wrong side back there in Firenze, you know. We think of that as funny, but it's actually very serious in his, it was just that it was 800 years ago. And Pound asks those questions again. They're good questions, and they're not easy to answer, but he asks those questions because of the way he is committed to bringing these things together uniquely to himself. And it's not easy. It's not easy. So thank you, Ted, actually.
Oh, certainly. Well, I agree with you. My approach here this evening was to accomplish some of what you were talking about. I have and every time I speak about Pound, everybody wants to talk about politics. I talked about politics in order to get it out of the way. Well, I mean, get it out of the way in the sense so it doesn't obstruct the other conversations we want to have. So, to Jennifer, who was concerned that I wasn't going to get to Ezra Pound, well, yeah, I was trying to lay the foundation of my views on Pound's vision of a modified version of Mussolini and Pound's attachment to that modified vision. That was my goal today. I don't know whether I achieved it or not.
I think you did, Ted. So before I say goodnight to you all, I want to thank everyone for coming, to invite you for the talks tomorrow night and the next night. We had a little taste of what those subjects might be with some of the questions from the audience. Jennifer, did you want to have a few parting words? No, okay. So if you all would take just a minute and fill out the survey for the Haley Public Library, we would really appreciate it. And again, thank you very, very much. Thank you, Jennifer, for organizing this lecture series, and thank you, Ted Dyer, for launching it.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.